In just the past 2 weeks, Warner Bros. Merged with Discovery, Ezra Miller was arrested, and hundreds of thousands of Snyder fans rallied to get hashtag Restore the SnyderVerse trending on Twitter, while coordinating an effort to put up billboards, stream banners behind planes, and whatever else they could, all to make their voices heard. We don't have a definitive answer to any of this, and my aim with this video is to look at the evidence for and against the possibility of the SnyderVerse being restored, to attempt to objectively inform the viewers what the likelihood of that happening appears to be. I have video reviews of many comic book movies, including both Justice Leagues, with more reviews on the way, so having those videos makes it easier for me to remain objective here, and defer my personal opinions to those reviews. I'll also leave out spoilers from upcoming films, as there was quite recently several major leaked details for 2023's Flash movie. So you can watch this video without worrying about that. Please don't discuss spoilers for that movie or anything else from DC's upcoming slate in the comments. That's my personal preference, and I'd like to make sure anyone who visits the comment section can do so safely without being spoiled for movies that are a year away. How's it going, everyone? My name's Graham and welcome to Two Left Thumbs. I assume anyone who clicked this video has at least passing familiarity with the SnyderVerse. If you feel like you know the background that led to this point, please feel free to skip ahead to the time on the screen. For anyone who feels they need a reminder, or feel behind on the news, I can give you a 2-minute summary that acts as a too long did not read for 10 years of movie making. The DCEU, which is DC Comics' answer to Marvel's cinematic universe, was kicked off with Man of Steel in 2013, directed by Zack Snyder. He also directed the sequel, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, in 2016. Zack Snyder remained heavily involved in the production and oversight of subsequent DC movies like Wonder Woman, laying the groundwork for the big team-up movie set to come at the end. This was Justice League, which had major production issues with the untimely passing of Zack's daughter. Directing duties were handed off to Joss Whedon, who had recently done 2 Avengers movies, to wrap production on Justice League. Whedon's cut of the movie was released in theaters in 2017, maimed beyond recognition, and was both a critical and commercial failure. The heads at WB panicked and began to shuffle and restructure their cinematic universe as aggressively as possible, abandoning plans for any Justice League sequels and squeezing out Zack Snyder in the process. The fans rallied with Release the Snyder Cut for years, eventually bringing the release of Zack Snyder's Justice League about in 2021. This cut of the film released on HBO Max as a 4-hour epic, allowing Zack the freedom to make the movie exactly as he had originally planned. The movie was notably more well received and had less studio interference than his own theatrical cut likely would have ever had. I mean, who was going to allow him to put a 4-hour movie in theaters? That wasn't going to happen. It felt like WB did this, caving to appease the Snyder fans, hoping that would quell the outcry, not anticipating that it would instead open the floodgates. With Snyder having plans for up to 2 sequels to this movie, fans began instead rallying with the new hashtag, Restore the SnyderVerse. It really is a case of, if you give a mouse a cookie, then they're gonna ask for a full Snyder universe. That's the quick version of how we ended up where we are. And now, a full year after the Snyder Cut was released, it is seemingly increasingly unlikely anyone wants to fork over the dough, which could easily be as high as $500 million, to see Snyder's series through. It's assumed a 4-hour cut of Justice League would have bombed at the box office, even under regular circumstances. But because it was released during a pandemic, exclusively on a streaming service, allowing for mass piracy, it's near impossible to gauge whether a general audience would have turned out for this movie. And you better believe, nobody is going to fund 2 expansive sequels to a movie that has almost no guarantees of success outside of a fervent and niche fanbase. Bless them for sticking to their guns, seeing us through to an eventual Snyder Cut, but calling 2 sequels to this rocky franchise a gamble would be a massive understatement. They would need to generate minimum $1 billion collectively to be considered a success. When you care about things like this and track movie news and headlines, it's easy to assume everyone else cares an equal amount. And we then overestimate the general audience's knowledge of these characters and movies. I have relatives who get confused when Superman doesn't show up in the Avengers movie. Yet these are the ticket-buying individuals who will lift a movie from a couple $100 million up to $1 billion. I guarantee only a fraction of people who saw No Way Home had seen every previous Spider-Man movie, and only a narrow subset of these moviegoers make it a point of seeing each and every movie in a massive franchise. Despite the strong fan reactions and their vocal rallies for a continued SnyderVerse, it's now been a full year and we're very, very unlikely to see 2 Justice League sequels. With all that in mind, let's dig into everything pointing against and in favor of a restored SnyderVerse. Let's get the more pessimistic points out of the way, the ones seemingly pointing towards the SnyderVerse being dead, with DC and WB seemingly committed to moving forward without Zack's involvement or continuing his story. First, their lineup of upcoming DCEU movies fairly clearly spells out that they are moving on. Most of DC's planned movies over 2022 and 23 are originals or sequels to movies that are not connected to Justice League, like Black Adam, Shazam 2, Batgirl, and Blue Beetle. They have plenty of other movies in various stages of development, including spin-offs of Wonder Woman and Birds of Prey, mixed with plenty of new IPs. And with standalones like The Batman or Joker, they obviously aren't opposed to exploring adaptations entirely separate from the DC Extended Universe continuity. They clearly don't feel tethered to what's been done before, and are at a point where they're willing to risk it on things that are new and different. Aquaman 2 will retain the cast established in Snyder's movies, but the first solo Flash movie has been turned into a Flashpoint event, a multiverse story that would allow DC to move forward with whatever cast and continuity they wanted. The plan is seemingly not to erase Snyder's movies, but to position DC films so they may keep or abandon whichever specifics from the first 10 years of the DCEU they wish. While we're talking about it, let's look more closely at that Flash movie coming in 2023. It is set to see Ezra Miller and Ben Affleck both return from Snyder's movies, reprising their roles as The Flash and Batman respectively. Michael Shannon will also return as General Zod from Man of Steel, and Kiersey Clemons as Iris West from Zack Snyder's Justice League. So this Flash movie intends to adhere to what was previously established, with the exception of Henry Allen now being played by Ron Livingston instead of Billy Crudup, which was strictly due to scheduling conflicts. However, this movie also sees Michael Keaton return to the role of Bruce Wayne, tying Batman and Batman Returns into this multiverse continuity. To even further confuse things, Michael Keaton will then again be Bruce Wayne in the Batgirl movie, but it will have the return of J.K. Simmons as James Gordon, first appearing in the role in Justice League. So while that doesn't exclude Affleck from future films in this franchise, it does show that DC is willing to play around with multiple portrayals of a single character, easily giving them the option to replace actors whenever they choose. And with this being a multiverse event film, supposedly resetting the timeline on some level, it feels likely they will use this as a send-off for Ben Affleck's Batman. The next major knock against the likelihood of the SnyderVerse's revival is the current state of that main cast. The least likely to be asked to return is Ray Fisher as Cyborg. Snyder and screenwriter Chris Terrio said they took the responsibility of DC's first black superhero very seriously, working directly with Fisher to make sure the voices of 2 white creators didn't negatively affect this representation. Cyborg was positioned to be the heart of the Justice League, being written with the most complete arc in that first movie, something we've now seen properly with the Snyder Cut. Fisher eventually took WB head-on, tweeting in 2020 that Joss Whedon, who had taken over directing Justice League, had behavior on set that was gross, abusive, unprofessional, and completely unacceptable. Fisher has largely been supported by his castmates, combined with historic evidence that Whedon has often been abusive on his sets. It is unlikely to be a fabricated story. Fisher also went to bat against the execs, saying they had enabled Whedon's behavior. He named names against the likes of producers Jeff Johns, Walter Hamada, and Toby Emmerich. Emmerich is the current chairman of Warner Bros. Picture Group. Johns was the head of DC Films while Justice League was being made, and Hamada took over that position after Justice League flopped. WB conducted an internal investigation to Fisher's claims and ruled in their own favor. Surprise, surprise. After years of warring with the heads of DC and WB, it's unlikely they are ever going to invite Ray Fisher back to any of their films. Things also aren't looking good for Ben Affleck or Ezra Miller, despite both appearing in 2023's Flash movie. Affleck's history with the character has been rather rocky. He admitted rather openly back in the day that he was reluctant to take the role. That's not an uncommon thing when these superhero roles often require 3, 5, or 9 movie commitments. Yet there were rumors since his very first appearance that he was already tired of the role. He always denied those rumors, and was even on board to write, direct, and star in a solo Batman movie. He was simply adamant that he didn't want the movie to be rushed, and he didn't like the idea of reverse engineering his movie to fit around a larger release schedule. As we crept up on the slated 2018 release date for that version of The Batman, Ben shared that he was frustrated by the process. There was high pressure to deliver a finished script, and his interviews promoting other movies often devolved into Batman questionnaires, with any and all answers he gave then being turned into clickbait headlines. That twisting of words and constant assumptions of how he felt about playing Batman was likely a great source of frustration for someone who was happy to play the role. Essentially bullying the guy is potentially the thing that most made him not want to stick around. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way. Years after all this, Ben looked back detailing his struggles with alcoholism, specifically at that time, along with his loved ones' concerns that Ben would drink yourself to death if you go through what you just went through again. Affleck willingly stepped aside, and in January 2017, Matt Reeves was brought in to direct, and Affleck's script was scrapped. That was fun to say. Ben himself has said, "I never got a script that I was happy with."
You know, I tried to direct a version of it and worked with a really good screenwriter, but just kind of couldn't come up with a version that couldn't crack it.
By that June, Affleck was still attached to Star, and in July he shared, "Let me be very clear. I am the luckiest guy in the world. Batman is the coolest fucking part in any universe." In later 2017, after Justice League's negative reception mixed with rumors that Batfleck would appear in the Flashpoint movie, he reasserted, "I always evaluate this stuff on the merit of the material." He wasn't fully in or out, he was waiting to see how things shook down. That version of the Flashpoint movie was delayed about 30 times, and by early 2019, Affleck had officially hung up the cowl, wanting to give someone else a shot at the role. Matt Reeves had already been hard at work at a new original script, and it was a simple transition to bring in an entirely new Batman. Skip ahead to now. After seeing a Flash script that pays tribute to the character and supposedly acts as a send-off of sorts, Ben agreed to return for one last movie. After all that, it's incredibly unlikely he'd come fully out of retirement to participate in 2 more massive movies as Bruce Wayne. It's not impossible, but I think a lot would have to change for him to want to come back. Now on to Ezra Miller. Back in 2019, they were reportedly unhappy with the lighter tone of the Flash script at that time and handed in their own script, which WB rejected. Based on this upcoming movie, it's quite obvious that Miller worked it out and agreed to stay in the role. About 2 years ago, we had this limited, shaky footage of Ezra Miller choking a fan in Reykjavik, Iceland. While I remember hearing about it at the time, it was somewhat swept under the rug and never really addressed by Miller or any WB executives, despite witnesses asserting that it was an outright attack from Miller against a fan. More recently, we've had oddities like Miller sharing footage of themselves making threats to the KKK and other unpredictable behavior.
The Beulahville chapter of the North Carolina Ku Klux Klan. Look, if y'all want to die, I suggest just killing yourselves with your own guns, okay? Otherwise, keep doing exactly what you're doing right now, and you know what I'm talking about, and then, we'll do it for you if that's really what you want.
Now, just at the end of March, Miller was arrested after being disorderly at a karaoke bar in Hawaii, harassing a couple there, eventually breaking into that couple's room and threatening them. Ezra Miller was arrested, the couple issued a restraining order, and rumors surfaced that Ezra has been causing issues throughout the island all month, being banned from multiple bars. It really seems like Miller has become increasingly unstable and needs help of some kind. The Flash movie is still over 1 year away. It's possible that by then Ezra will be in a better place to promote the film and potentially return for sequels. But with further rumors that they have been erratic and difficult on their movie sets, it seems like some bridges have been burned, and WB could easily use the Flashpoint premise as an excuse to recast the character moving forward. If things are already being reset anyways, it really wouldn't be that big of a deal to recast one more person. So while Fisher, Affleck, and Miller are looking the least likely to return, things aren't looking great the whole way down. Man of Steel came out nearly 10 years ago. While Snyder considers Batman v Superman to be Man of Steel 2, Henry Cavill has seemingly never seen it that way. A proper sequel to that film had cycled through numerous directors over the years, and as recently as 2019, Mission Impossible 5 through 8 director Christopher McQuarrie pitched a sequel alongside Cavill to the studio, but their pitch was rejected. With no plans on the horizon, Cavill's schedule felt wide open, and he took on the role of Geralt of Rivia for Netflix's Witcher series. A project like that is not a role you take lightly. A fantasy epic series such as that will have to film in many locations over many months, requiring commitments from Cavill on and off for nearly half a year every year for the foreseeable future. And with the Flash movie now set to introduce Supergirl instead, that's one of their possible new directions. And on Cavill's birthday last year, May 6th, WB announced they were developing a Superman reboot. While Henry has expressed interest in returning to the role, he has no further movies contracted, and it appears the studio is moving on to new things. That door certainly isn't closed. I'm certain if Zack specifically asked, he would come back. But with the studio stringing him along for all this time only to put him in 3 movies, I wouldn't be surprised if he feels quite over it. Speaking of contracts, that brings us to Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman and Jason Momoa's Aquaman. Gal originally signed a 3-picture deal that was satisfied through Batman v Superman, Wonder Woman, and Justice League. She renegotiated herself to a huge pay bump for Wonder Woman 2, and has since then agreed to come back for a 3rd movie. However, she's indicated that she'd like that 3rd movie to provide closure, seemingly indicating she'd like her time in the role to come to an end. While Momoa signed a 4-picture deal. It's assumed his Batman v Superman cameo doesn't count, meaning Aquaman, Justice League, and the upcoming Aquaman 2 will still not have concluded his contract. I would predict after their very unlikely billion-dollar success with the first Aquaman, WB will push to complete that contract through a series-ending trilogy. And where it goes from there, who knows? Whether this cast has been burned, willfully retired, mishandled, or various other uncertain circumstances, it does not appear any of that main cast is positioned for 2 more Justice League movies. Not without a lot of swallowed pride, major caveats, and huge payouts. It is not a strong outlook. While I mentioned names like Walter Hamada and Toby Emmerich briefly while discussing Ray Fisher's position, I need to look at these two more closely. Walter Hamada has a head position at DC Films, and Toby Emmerich is the current chairman of the Warner Bros. Pictures Group. Hamada has historically boxed out Snyder, instead calling the theatrical Justice League canon. Considering that's the version the majority of people know, despite it being a bomb, I can understand the argument. Based on box office revenue, a minimum of 30 million people saw that in theaters, not including DVD sales and streaming audiences. As well as Zack Snyder's Justice League may have performed, the 2017 cut remains the version the average person is familiar with. We don't know specifically who this quote came from, but in an interview, Hamada revealed that studio executives at DC see the Snyder Cut as a storytelling cul-de-sac. Maybe this is just one of those workarounds where someone says, "people say," when really they mean they say it's coming from them, but we'll never really know. We can assume that this is a position that Hamada agrees with. Hamada has instead put his chips on James Gunn, and it's clear after Peacemaker being renewed for season 2 and another The Suicide Squad spin-off being in development with Gunn that the trust in his vision and direction is continuing to grow. Then there's Toby Emmerich. As the WB Pictures chairman, he was the one who called up Snyder and asked if he'd be interested in actually completing the Snyder Cut. But that means he was also in a position to revive the SnyderVerse if he so chose. And that clearly hasn't happened yet. If that's something he wanted to do, he probably would have done it within the last year. With Emmerich retaining his position after the WB Discovery merger, DC's Snyder-free slate is likely to remain as is. Releasing the Snyder Cut based on a hashtag made sense. There was this momentum and viral quality being pushed online. Through a minimal investment, they were able to see that through. While the current Restore the SnyderVerse hashtag potentially has some weight, they are much more likely to look at the data, like views, watch time, rewatching, and various other metrics on Zack Snyder's Justice League that they will likely be using instead to determine whether or not to produce further films. Which brings me to what is seemingly the nail in the coffin. Snyder is busy. He is currently filming Rebel Moon, a 2-part film for Netflix, and is set to direct a sequel to Army of the Dead, positioning him to have 2 major movie universes that he has complete control over. Plus, he's developing various other projects and signed a first-look deal with Netflix. He comfortably has work for a minimum of 5 years, more likely 10 if he wants it, with an easy option with Netflix that would allow him to continue forward with essentially whatever interests him. Zack remains an executive producer on The Flash and Aquaman 2, but that seems to be a legacy position, holding over from his heavy involvement in the DC universe when those characters and films were initially being developed. It's unlikely he has a lot of say in those movies. The main takeaway is that Zack could easily opt to steer clear of all this drama and instead focus his creative energies on original works without the fear of studio interference. And after this crazy uphill climb, that's gotta feel pretty damn appealing. He obviously still loves those characters and that story, and I won't attempt to speculate on how committed he remains. So, studio heads remain committed to their current DC lineup and are not greenlighting new projects connected to the SnyderVerse. The original cast is unlikely to be reassembled, and the man himself has work for many, many years. There appears to be a giant neon sign flashing, indicating that the SnyderVerse is dead. The effort, logistics, and expenses of assembling everyone needed to film 2 enormous movies is unlikely to happen. And that's just to finish the Justice League trilogy. The actual rally for a completely restored SnyderVerse would include a released Ayer cut of Suicide Squad, Man of Steel 2, and Ben's solo Batman movie. Seeing that through would require tearing down much of what is currently planned at DC, and the total cost now reaches upwards of $1 billion. Banking on returns from movies that have never been commercially or critically well received is an astronomically unlikely risk to be taken. Things are not looking good. But I wouldn't say all hope is lost. There are still a few glimmers suggesting that we could see the SnyderVerse restored. I saved those for second so we can end on a more optimistic note. Whether or not that be a full series or the much more likely reality of 2 Justice League sequels, here's the evidence we have supporting this movement. Eagle-eyed fans have been monitoring socials of all kinds for behind-the-scenes hints being dropped. It's not unheard of for major comic book movie news to be teased by creative teams and actors looking to build some hype. While each of these ought to be taken with a grain of salt, this is the supposed list of SnyderVerse revival teases shared in chronological order. Snyder has shared plenty of Justice League and DC related teasos on his Vero account over the years. And on November 25th, 2021 for American Thanksgiving, he posted this video of a turkey. In the background, we can see Grant Morrison's 2008 miniseries Final Crisis, along with a pair of notebooks. Final Crisis is a story arc where Darkseid gets the anti-life equation, a major plot thread of Zack's planned trilogy. Next, most of the cast of the original Suicide Squad have expressed support for an Ayer cut, and David Ayer himself has shared images and script page leaks of his original film for quite some time. Most recently, in late February, he shared a short clip of Joker and Harley from his cut of the movie. The Snyder cut was approved without Zack ever sharing literal footage from it. Having leaked footage come from the director renewed a lot of interest in the Ayer cut and the SnyderVerse hashtags. Not that they had ever really fully disappeared. Back in December 2021, coming after the Snyder Cut saw him return as Deathstroke, Joe Manganiello expressed that he had moved on, stating, "No, I let that go a while ago." However, this March, Joe changed his profile picture to a stylized portrait of himself as Deathstroke. And shortly after that, only a few weeks ago, coming March 18th, Wayne T. Carr, who is set to be Snyder's Green Lantern, tweeted out this incredible image of him in character, even setting it as his own profile picture. And finally, Clay Staub, a frequent collaborator and second unit director on Zack's movies, including Dawn of Justice and Justice League, has repeatedly tweeted his support for the Restore the SnyderVerse movement, and more recently on April 9th, informed fans he will be busy through most of May. This could be him working on any number of things. Very likely, he's again a second unit director on Snyder's Rebel Moon, which just began filming. All of that feels worth sharing. None of it is concrete evidence that anyone should use as full confirmation of the SnyderVerse's revival. But that timeline catches us up with this past week, which saw the merger of Warner Bros. And Discovery. One major reason fans thought this would be promising for the future of the SnyderVerse was the potential for studio heads to be shuffled or replaced, with fans being hopeful that a more Snyder-sympathetic person would be put in a position of power. As I covered in the last section, this did not occur. There were no major studio head shakeups. One major removal with this merger was of Ann Sarnoff, a Warner Media chairman who was largely responsible for overseeing WB's Harry Potter universe. However, she did at one time comment about a year ago with Variety talking about the Snyder Cut and other aspects of DC films. She had said, "We're just so happy that he could bring his cut of the Justice League to life because that wasn't in the plan until about a year ago. With that comes the completion of his trilogy. We're very happy we've done this, but we're very excited about the plans we have for all the multi-dimensional DC characters that are being developed right now." So she was of the position that those 3 released films were a completed trilogy and she was fully ready to move on from Snyder. She followed that up by saying she has no interest in developing David Ayer's Suicide Squad. So while not someone who is specifically ever going to make this call, it's seemingly one less person in the room who's voting against the SnyderVerse. The only thing in the positive column here seemed to be this article clip being shared around, which read, "Warner executives have prided themselves on creating prestige television such as HBO's Succession and Euphoria, and epic movies including Batman v Superman and The Matrix." Unfortunately, this was taken out of context. Looking at the article, rereading that statement, this is the author's voice and words. There's nothing being quoted here, and is instead simply a list of properties WB is known for present on HBO Max. Sorry to squash excitement on that one. Toby Emmerich, and for the sake of keeping straight who's who, this is the chairman of Warner Bros. Picture Group, was recently quoted on DC Films Future. "The movies don't have to all have the same tone or interlock with other DC movies or have an Easter egg that sets up another film. Quality is the most important factor for a studio, and the biggest thing you can do to influence quality is the filmmaker that you hire." With 3 concurrent Batmans actively appearing on the big screen, it's obvious that DC has found a more relaxed strategy than Marvel, and is open to entertaining multiple sub-stories and alternate timelines, potentially entirely separate universes. This seemingly leaves a door wide open to produce the complete Justice League trilogy and beyond. Next, we have David Zaslav, who was the CEO of Discovery Inc. After the merger, he is now the president of the newly formed Warner Bros. Discovery. We have a new player in a high enough position to potentially influence some of these decisions. But it's been said numerous times that he's known for his frugality. Something like a minimum $500 million investment might be too big a risk to chew, especially when trying to ease this transition and not immediately rock the boat. His reputation at Discovery was of a person who does not give second chances to teams or properties that do not make their money back. Nearly a year ago, Zaslav name-dropped the Trinity on his list of important IPs that WB holds.
"We're probably the best media company in the world with the greatest IP, the most iconic IP. Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman."
So at least he's smart enough to see their general value, but in no way does that indicate that he specifically favors the SnyderVerse. It simply tells us that he's aware of the thing that most people are, that those characters are popular. However, Zaslav did state that a Discovery team will take over the HBO Max streaming service. So while WB and DC heads remain in place, it is possible that new leadership will be in charge of what releases on that platform, leading to the potential for Zack Snyder's Justice League to remain an HBO original, thus treated as a separate IP from the DCEU. This is maybe supported by the Snyder Cut being advertised as a Max original on the platform, so it's possible Emmerich and Hamada wouldn't have a say. Something weighing against this point, however, is that in the middle of this week, just on April 13th, Zaslav had already started announcing some of the top execs who would be looking after various branches of this new company, including some key people like Casey Bloys, who is the chief of HBO and HBO Max. So if they aren't changing position, then maybe no one else in a really critical role will either. It's hard to say at this point. While not the path they predicted, this seems to be the avenue forward that Snyder fans were hoping for. They expected that maybe Emmerich or Hamada would be replaced. Seeing as that didn't happen, streaming is now the best bet. So with that feeling like the most likely SnyderVerse avenue forward, let's break down that possibility in some detail. While that original theatrical Justice League bombed and the Snyder Cut doesn't have a box office to gauge financial success with, we can still look at its reported streaming numbers. And despite being one of the most heavily pirated films in 2021, it still had promising results. In Canada, we can watch HBO content through our streaming service Crave, and Zack Zack Snyder's Justice League set the record as Crave's most streamed content ever, beating out the previous record holder dating back to 2019, which was the series finale of Game of Thrones. But Canada is a notably smaller audience pool. It only took about 1.1 million streams to break that record. Not to undermine how big of a deal the Game of Thrones finale was, but 1 million people seeing a movie is not a definition of success. Looking further, on HBO Max, Zack Snyder's Justice League had less first-week streams than Wonder Woman 1984, Godzilla vs. Kong, and the Mortal Kombat reboot. While not very strong numbers, its total amount of streams had doubled within a month, up to nearly 4 million, showing more of a continued, sustained interest in the title. It's understandable with a 4-hour epic that people would be choosy about when exactly they sat down to commit to that. So its streaming numbers had more of a tail rather than one giant spike all in the first week or two. Long-term streaming service tracking suggests that Squid Game, WandaVision, and Loki were the only properties in 2021 to outrank Zack Snyder's Justice League on audience engagement. And on top of that, it put forward incredibly strong Blu-ray sales. It's unlikely a movie of this length could ever find success in theaters, but it's shown it has the potential to be a staple of HBO Max's original catalog, acting as something that viewers watch many times over in the future. If they ever wanted to make sequels, they'd either have to be shorter or entirely relegated to streaming. As I've detailed years ago in my video, The Netflix Series Problem, evidence suggests an audience is more likely to rewatch a completed series, whereas they will eventually grow tired of rewatching and less frequently recommend a series that ends on a cliffhanger. While Snyder's biggest fans will watch this movie forever, it likely has a lot less rewatchability to the average viewer. Now, with the success of other DC titles like Peacemaker, and them experimenting by putting movies like Batgirl straight to the streaming platform, it's not out of the question that Warner Bros. Sees the value in creating a separate continuity of Snyder movies exclusively for their streaming service. If they ever announce a release of David Ayer's cut of Suicide Squad, I would take that as an incredibly positive sign that WB Discovery is continuing to test out the viability of niche for the fans' releases on their HBO platform. And if that gets a release date, I would expect an announcement of Justice League 2 and 3 to follow. I have 2 more points to make, pointing towards the possibility of a restored SnyderVerse. They're less specific, but they might be among the biggest reasons we might ever see a SnyderVerse continued. The first, that cannot be undervalued, is fan support. That Snyder cut only exists after a lengthy campaign of fans asking for it to be released. And while I imagine some of those supporters moved on after realizing their goal, there is still an incredibly loud cry for the SnyderVerse, consistently cracking into the trending section of Twitter for a year straight, once again emerging to the top alongside the news of this WB Discovery merger, hoping to catch the eye of these higher ups. And before closing this section out, finally, potentially the most important factor, yet one that is very easy to overlook, all these actors genuinely loved working with Zack. You essentially can't find a bad word online about the guy personally. In an industry packed with shady characters, difficult, power-hungry directors, and demanding producers or executives, everyone loves Zack and defends his work at every given opportunity. I rarely see a director who inspires that much loyalty in his cast and crew, and it's wonderful to see and hear. Having him at the center of this whole thing means that if he can ever find his way back, it's significantly more likely that others would follow suit. Those are all the specifics I can share for now, so let's sort of wrap things up. I've kept personal opinion out of this until now, but as I summarize, I do intend to weigh in. The DCEU has been a mixed bag. It's ranged from miserable to bad, with a few standouts that have kept it afloat despite its failures. With some major course correcting taking place post-Justice League, new continuities being spun off, including the multiverse being opened, DC has given themselves options. They can pillage stories, characters, and whatever else they want from those early movies, and continue forward in a totally new direction. They seem very committed to this approach and are unlikely to cancel the majority of those plans. But it does always leave the option open for the SnyderVerse to become an adjacent property. The heads of WB and DC seem to have no interest in pursuing this further, and while Zaslav is unlikely to greenlight anything personally, there is the possibility that his new HBO Max team does attempt to revive the SnyderVerse. Streaming appears to be the only viable path forward, especially if the second and third movies were also poised to be 4-hour epics. I legitimately believe that all the talent would willingly return as long as Zack was attached. However, Ezra Miller and Ray Fisher may be barred from participating by the bigwigs. But the only reason Zack would really come back is if he was given the power to have final say in the cut of the movie or the cast that's involved. So that might not be an issue. But keeping in mind that contracts are ending for the other actors and new projects for them are all well underway, most of that Justice League lineup are likely done with DC entirely. 10 years is a long time to hang around. The Hugh Jackmans of the comic book world willing to play a character for 17 years are going to be few and far between. And with Zack now being deep into projects that are entirely his own, with no need to answer to anyone or play these insane political games, I imagine he'd have to be granted a lot of assurances to ever want to come back. They could attempt to continue his vision forward with someone else behind the camera. That obviously didn't work before, but maybe Clay Staub, sharing a strong enough connection to Snyder, already being his go-to second unit director, could maybe execute that accurately? It's unlikely the fans would accept that, especially when a huge appeal of the series is Zack's style, flavor, and attention to detail. It pretty much would have to be him in the director's chair. While the fans and many individuals involved in Snyder's movies remain committed to this rally cry, it's hard to imagine a way forward where everyone gets on the same page and signs off on this massive expense. It's not impossible by any means, but I highly doubt we'll ever see the completed Justice League trilogy. One of the only possibilities I see would maybe be something like an animated series. That would make it far easier to assemble the original cast and would cause far less internal disputes and production issues. And maybe Zack could be saved some effort, instead approving storyboards while continuing work on his other movies. But it would still be an expensive undertaking, demanding on Zack's already packed schedule, and it's unclear whether that would be rejected or embraced by the fandom. What do you guys think? If you were to look at the evidence as objectively as possible, how likely does a fully restored SnyderVerse or simply a pair of Justice League sequels feel? I don't agree with the Snyder cult mentality of demanding these films, that Snyder is immune to criticism or attacking anyone who disagrees. I assume Snyder also isn't okay with any of that. But as someone who personally loves superheroes, comic book movies, and appreciates when a creative individual is given the freedom to execute their vision, yeah, I genuinely enjoy seeing 2 Justice League sequels, as long as they didn't take the place of other DC movies. I'd rather they all coexist and everyone retains their separate sandboxes to go buck wild in. But my prediction is we will unfortunately never see these movies. The risks are too great, the talent, executives, and creatives have become too fractured, and it largely feels like the ship has sailed. I'd say there's like a 10% chance we get 2 Justice League movies, and a near 0% chance we get things like Man of Steel 2 and Ben's Batman movie in addition to those. I'll gladly eat my words if the day ever comes, but unfortunately, this seems like the end of the road for the SnyderVerse. I hope after this video people will be interested in checking out my comic book movie reviews. I'm not specifically a DC or Marvel fanboy, I'm a superhero fan and a movie fan. I attempt to do these lengthy, comprehensive reviews, sharing everything I liked or disliked, regardless of my overall review. If I give a movie 3 out of 10, I still try to find things to talk about that I liked, or if I give it a 9 out of 10, I'll still critique whatever it was that I feel didn't work. I made this video despite running a YouTube poll suggesting the audience really didn't care. And that's because I wasn't really seeking permission, I was simply curious what the interest was. I'll always pursue videos based on what I'm currently most excited to talk about, thus the variety nature of this channel. Comic book movies is a subject I enjoy talking about. I find the behind-the-scenes production of movies incredibly fascinating, and hopefully some of that passion also comes through in my video reviews. I'll have a playlist of that in the description, as well as the video end cards here. Thank you all for watching, thank you to patrons of the channel, I look forward to geeking out with all of you in the comments, and I'll see you again soon.